Hello, this is Eric Morris Eskenazi. I am the host of the Rack Dispatches podcast. Since April is National Poetry Month, I have a special guest on this latest episode, Tamara Sellman. She has a collection of poetry called Intention Tremor. Tamara has a very impressive career. She's written journalism, creative writing, poetry, and also she has a background in sleep health. During this very sprawling podcast episode, Tamara explores her professional career, her inspirations, and keeping a very positive attitude while living with MS. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, I've been using Anchor.fm now for about almost a year for the podcast Erratic Dispatches, which is distributed through Anchor.fm. It's completely free to use, very easy, and any audio that you upload or record through the website, it will be you can use it to organize your audio files, and once your podcasts are ready to submit, it will be available to stream within at least 8 different streaming sites. So Tamara, so I was looking over your credentials. You have a very impressive background. You've been an independent journalist with, like, I guess, at least 35 years of experience in publishing, and you've also worked a lot in sleep health and health literacy. So do you mind starting off with discussing about first your education background and also like what your early inspirations and what you got started in both doing creative writing and also in regards to the field that you end up studying at school?
Okay, yeah. Really, we can go back 50 years because I started writing when I was literally 4 or 5. I was in preschool. So my parents were called to the preschool before school one day, and the teacher gave me a box of color chalk and said, write something on the chalkboard. And I thought I was in so much trouble. Oh, I was terrified. And so I wrote a complete sentence because she just said, write whatever, write a sentence. I didn't have a book or anything. I just wrote it out. And then I discovered that was cool. And I was not in trouble. And then it sort of struck me that here is something that is, I knew then that was special. And I enjoyed doing it. And right away, I just felt like this is who I am. And I literally have lived my life moving forward, always striving to find a way to use writing in whatever I do. So I studied journalism in college at Columbia in Chicago. And that was a great experience. I sort of dilly-dallied in the creative writing program there too, which I took enough of it to be really sorry that I didn't finish it, because it was really, I learned so much from this John Schultz. Because I, as a child, wrote tons of short stories and poems and even some plays and whatever. And I just loved it. I always wanted to be a novelist, actually. But it was more practical, at least at the time, this is back in the 80s, to study journalism, right? Because that was a paying job. Now, things totally changed, but whatever, that's a different talk for another time. So I studied journalism, got my degree there, and went into editing and magazine publishing and that kind of thing, and pursued that as a freelancer or doing independent work for clients and so forth until I had children. And then I decided, I had in my mind thought, well, I'll wait until I'm old and retired to write that great American novel. And then I was like, no, I don't have to wait. I can just do that now. And I did some work early on when my kids were very young, but mostly I was creative writing and doing tons of reading and teaching myself what I didn't get from that workshop program, because I just was too impatient to graduate and move on with my life. And so then I started this creative writing thing, and went into sort of micro publishing, which is kind of short form for blogging before there were blogs. If there had been a blog, it would have been so much easier, but they didn't even have like the utilities to do that. So I had to learn all of these, I had to learn HTML and figure out how to
Mhm.
create my own website in Angel Fire, which still
Mhm.
exists, believe it
Mhm.
or not. I still have my old website up there. And so that was something I just maintained and just kept my skills up while I raised my kids, and really enjoyed writing short fiction, but also different kinds of exploratory or experimental kinds of fiction and poetry too. And then as my kids got older, I decided I really wanted to get back into more of a journalism focus, but seeing what was happening in journalism, I realized there was this need for specializing. And I come from a family where science was really important. I decided I think I should pursue science writing. And it made sense to me to get some medical credentials that I could put behind my name in order to get those science writing gigs. And so I went back to school at age 47 and became a polysomnographer, which is a fancy name for a sleep technologist. And 2 years later, then I got my second medical credential, which is in clinical sleep health education.
Mhm.
And at about this time, this is also when I started to feel all kinds of weird symptoms, like a lot of them. And right around the time that I graduated from sleep technology school, I also was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which brings you to the collection of my new book that's Intention Tremor, which is a collection of writing creative nonfiction and poetry about my journey living with this new and unexpected diagnosis. So hopefully that's a really short, summary of my writing life. There's so much more than that, but
Mhm. Tamara, discuss about about your background in the sleep education. I'd like to know more about that.
oh, it's really interesting. I have to say, I feel like I've been paying attention in my life because things happen in the universe, and they have really paying attention to the things that happen have really, carved out that space for me. And so I'm really grateful for that. Um, about 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, actually, I went in, I was having, this is prior to my MS diagnosis, I was having a lot of problems with sleep. I was so tired during the day, literally so tired that at one point I was working as a developmental editor with clients where I would interact with them online. And we would be in the middle of a meeting and I would face plant right into my laptop. I would just fall asleep. And I was just like, this is not right. This is not
Mhm.
good. And so I talked to my doctor, and he set me up for a sleep study, which I went in and did. And we did two studies. The first one was the overnight study to see if I had sleep apnea, which at that time I didn't. And then I had a series of nap tests, which happened during the day. And they do that in order to figure out whether you have narcolepsy or not, see how hard it is for you to stay awake during the day. And then a few weeks later, it's so funny. I was just passing by this clinic the other day. Um, I had to drive out to see my doctor to get my test results. And it was one of those drives where I was so tired that I had the windows rolled down and the music blaring. And I was just like, wake up,
Mhm.
trying to stay awake just to get to my sleep doctor's appointment. Irony. And then I got there 15 minutes later, or 15 minutes early, fell asleep in my car and was late to my appointment.
Mhm.
But all that to say that I was fascinated with the whole process of a sleep study, completely foreign to me. I had a really good sleep technologist and I really felt well cared for. And I thought, wow, this is like a really interesting career path. I discovered that I didn't have narcolepsy nor sleep apnea, at least at that time. So I was sort of a big question mark. I had some sort of vague diagnoses after that, which I sort of lived with. Um, but in the meantime, as a journalist, I was going online like everybody does to learn about sleep problems, and discovering not a lot of great information, which really inspired me as a sleep professional. to create my own website, which is something I did separately. But then when I sat down to figure out what I wanted to be, if I wanted to go into science writing, that was like, oh, obviously I need to become a sleep technologist so that I could really learn the inside out of that. And my experience had been so positive. I felt like, oh, I could do this. And so it is a fascinating field. And I have been working in some fashion of sleep medicine as a technologist and an educator, well, for 8 years now. And I am not even close to being bored with it. I mean, there's just so many facets to it. We have so many sleep problems generally as a culture. We have some new ones now because of COVID. And I have learned so much from that. And I'm thrilled to keep doing my work in that field.
So do you mainly work in small clinics, or you also work at like major hospitals or universities or
Okay, so
nonprofits?
I started out working at a hospital, a local hospital, and then I worked at a satellite clinic that was aligned with that hospital, so not the same campus, so an independent facility. And then I could only do it for a couple of years because it just overnight shift work just does not work well if you have a neurological condition. So I did it for as long as I could because I really love working with patients actually. But I also just wanted to really get as much experience as I could so that I could really have the compassion that it takes to write about sleep disorders. Because I think there's plenty of clinical reportage about sleep health, but I wanted to, my style is more chatty and maybe more personal and human interest level. And I really wanted to make sure that I had that experience working with people as opposed to with information. Then I had to kind of leave that behind because that overnight shift was just like killing me. It's just not doable. A lot of people can't do it, even with drugs. And I did have drugs for that. And I'm glad I don't have to take those anymore. And then so I decided to create this website, Sleepyhead Central, as a way to create a calling card out there in the world to show that here I am, a journalist who actually has this sleep technology and health education background. And not very long after, I landed my first writing gigs, writing for doctors, different doctor clients for their blogs. And then I went from that to some nonprofits. And I still have, I kind of hopped around and ended up working for a couple of health, what do you call them, patient advocacy community organizations, which are businesses where they have different health community forums and where people generate content. And I had also written this kind of not very, very short, it was a long time ago, a blog about living with MS. And someone read that and reached out to me and said, hey, we really need more people to write about living with MS. And so I checked that out and I actually landed 2 different writing gigs writing about MS. And then I was able, in one of those companies who I still work for, and I love working for them, Health Union, started writing about sleep health for people with chronic illness. So I'd write about sleep and fatigue as well as multiple sclerosis. And after a while, having so many different little gigs, it was just like too much. I have these like, ADD kind of things that happen that are part of the whole MS experience. And so I had to really whittle down where my brain space was being dedicated. And so now I write educational models for the Sleep Technology Association. And I write about sleep health for Health Union, and as well as multiple sclerosis. And I also do some moderating of some forums and other things. But I've kind of settled into this pathway that I really love. I feel like, I'm doing the thing I wanted to do when I was 4. I'm writing in a way that's helping people. And then I'm also being able to write about poetry, using poetry and creative forms as another way, in ways and means to reach people.
With the sleep health work, does it ever entail like working with people or patients that have like like dreams, that affect their sleep, like nightmares and that sort of
Oh
thing?
yeah, yeah. I don't think I really had any patients that really had nightmare disorders.
Hmm.
Although maybe, I mean, you would hear, you have a mic on people when they're sleeping at night, and
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
hear all the sounds that they make, and there would be people talking in their sleep,
Hmm.
or you could actually see them moving around, and you could kind of discern just by watching them that they were having a nightmare.
Hmm.
So I'll yeah, and dreams are a fascination for me. So that's an area where I want to spend more time writing about too, not from a clinical aspect, but more maybe from a very personal one, as uh, a rich dream life is really a big thing in my family. I mean, that's something we've been talking about forever. We've done some sleepwalking in my family. We all have sleep apnea. I do have sleep apnea. But the just vivid dreams that just seem like totally real, and then hallucinations that go with those dreams, that's totally runs in my family. So I like to take the scientific approach, so it makes me less self-conscious of that weirdness. But it's also just really fascinating, and it's really an area of science that we still just don't know that much about, but they're doing what they can. So
Are there any like well-known journals that cover sleep health and sleep studies?
well, the one that I would recommend for just a general population, if you're really fascinated, is just Sleep Review. It has a lot of clinical, stuff in there, but it has a lot of very accessible reportage on, things that are happening in the world of sleep medicine. And they usually tend to lean toward things that are topics that are way more popular in the general population. So I would definitely read Sleep Review for
Okay.
that. I would say there's fewer journals that cover sleep. I mean, for 2 years, I published a literary journal called Vitamin Z, which was nothing but sleep
Hmm.
poetry and short fiction and nonfiction. And that was just sort of a fun little boutique project that I did. But I would say there are lots of really good books on it too. So some classics like the one by Dr. Dement is like a classic. So is the one Sleep by Carlos Schenk. That's another one. And then Julie Flagger wrote a book called Wide Awake and Dreaming about her experience with narcolepsy. That is just super, super fascinating. So
There was like a documentary which I haven't seen yet, but it really covered about sleep paralysis and
yeah,
that sort of point, and you're like like waking up and you can't move, and it's kind of scary, you
it's
know.
super scary. I've had that. It's
Hmm.
super scary. And then you hear things or see things sometimes, and then you
Hmm.
can't do anything. It's really
Hmm.
weird.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's also a really good movie called oh gosh, Mike Birbiglia, Sleepwalk with Me is a fantastic movie. It's his story of living with REM behavior disorder, which is a sort of dream enactment behavior. And he's a stand-up comedian who's very famous. He's got shows, on Broadway and everything. He's super famous. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Hmm.
And that one actually features Dr. Bill Dement in a scene, but it's really his. It's very funny, of course, because he's a comedian. But it's just his tracking of that experience before he was diagnosed with RBD, but really brought a lot of awareness to a condition that is actually linked to dementias and Parkinson's later on in life. So we need to know more about the dream enactment, because we're not supposed to be acting out the dreams at
Hmm.
all. So the fact that people think that's normal is really scary, because that's not normal at all. So
And which kind of like you've had your creative writing and poetry like in many anthologies, and has your work appeared like international
yeah,
publications as well?
yeah. I mean, yeah, different. I would say I've published things that were in print journals in Mexico and France and the UK, um, and then in Canada, and then United States. And I just, a lot of them are short stories. I read a lot of more experimental things. So they have a very specific niche that's kind of hard to find. But, I've been able to publish just about everything somewhere. It's not a job that you make a lot of money at, but
Hmm.
I take a lot of pleasure at doing it. So, and then poetry too,
Hmm.
all over the place. So yeah, online and in print. Mhm.
Have you taught like writing classes or creative writing classes?
I have. I used to, and I'm not a teacher. I don't have a
Mhm.
background in teaching. I was more as a coach. So I would do some coaching in which I would help writers to either reclaim a lost writing practice or to start a new one, to get over writer's block or to deal with the challenges of revising things. And so I had some online workshops about a decade ago. But then that's when I started getting really tired all the time. And I kind of had to let some things go because I needed more active, I needed to do work that was not so passive, sitting in front of a computer. I mean, which is all that writing is, of course. But at that time, I didn't know that I had all these other things happening. So yeah, I did teach these fun little workshops, and I really enjoyed it. But again, it was just, I was so tired all the time. I didn't
Mhm.
know, I had no idea what was going on. But now I know, and now I know how to prepare for that too. And I am creating a new series of like coaching hybrid workshops for people with chronic illness who want to
Mhm.
write about it. So not
Great.
necessarily literary so much as helping people to tell their stories, because in the end, that's what it's about. It's about telling your story, because if you share that story, you might be able to help someone out of the pit they found themselves in, especially when it comes to chronic illness. There's so many mysteries and
Mhm.
so much bad information that it's hard to discern what to believe. And so we don't have this, it's kind of like when I was a parent, they don't give you a guidebook for how to be a parent. Well, when you become chronically ill and you get a diagnosis, no one gives you a guidebook for that either. And you have to
Mhm.
kind of find your way. So really the best way is to find your people and talk to each other. And by being able to write about it, you can do more than talk to each other. You can talk to a whole lot of people, and then they can talk back to you too. And to me, that dialogue is just like crucial to having healthy mental health as you're dealing with all these physical things that you didn't, certainly didn't ask for, and um, they certainly don't know enough about. So
Mhm.
even if they can't solve the mysteries, at least you can find people that understand, and there's whole conversations you don't have to have with them too.
Mhm. And have you worked like with art therapists in regards to using writing as therapy?
I haven't, but I
Mhm.
totally love this question, because there has always been, and it probably will never go away, but there's always been this idea that creating for therapy isn't as valid as creating to be artful or to be an
Mhm.
artist. And I kind of think that's bullshit.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think that when you're creating from yourself, whatever it is, whatever, form that might take, whether it's dance or a poem or making a movie or whatever, it all ends up being about story. And it's but you can't tell a story that means something to anybody else unless it means something to you. And when you start writing about your own situation, especially a physical or mental health situation, that's really therapeutic.
Mhm.
And why wouldn't that be useful? Of course that's useful. I mean, we all know that talk therapy exists for a reason. Even if
Mhm.
you're talking to yourself through a journal or maybe through writing poems or whatever. So I feel like there's an there's a therapeutic factor to creating anything, because I don't think people just create and avoid. I don't think they just,
Mhm.
or maybe they do, and that kind of work just doesn't move me.
Mhm.
And that would be fine. There's work for everybody, every taste out there. I don't care. But for me, the work that resonates most with me is the kind that comes from deep inside a person, and you can
Mhm.
see that, and it's artful, it's beautiful. Whether it's any form, whether it's poetry or dance or film, um, there has to be something, really a human element to that has to really be born out of the therapeutic creative process that begins at the very beginning, before, when it's still raw and
Mhm.
when you're still trying to explore and understand. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
one of those writers that writes to learn. I mean, I don't write because I know it all. I'm writing to suss it out and figure it out. So I like that question. So I haven't dealt with art therapists, although I do think that's a fantastic approach too. And I think there's something to be learned from them. Absolutely.
So for your latest collection of poetry, Intention Tremor, it was published through MoonPath Press. How did you approach them in regards to the publication?
You know, I did it like every other person without a book does it. I just started submitting my manuscript to all the different poetry publishers. It was tricky because I can't ever do anything just in a way that's normal, apparently. This is true across everything I do, but because this is a collection of work that's not just poetry, but it's also creative experimental forms of prose. That makes it less poetry to some people. And so you're sending things out, hoping they'll understand this hybrid idea of there's these poems, but then there's also this prose. And I guess I started out writing it truly as poetry, but I'm a prose writer at heart. And to me, it would have been a lie to just present only poetry because that's not who I am. And I felt like I was like cutting off a part of myself in order to write this book that was about myself. So that seems silly. And so at some point, I had started writing it literally as an abecedarian, which is a form of poetry, a collection of poetry or whatever, in which every new work starts with the succeeding letter in the alphabet. So A, B, C, D, E. Each part had a new title with a different, following that progression. And I got to where I'd written like 21 out of the 26 letters of the alphabet. I even had Z. And then I was like, I was really dissatisfied. And so I started moving some things around. And then I started seeing how some poems really just wanted to be blocks of prose. Some of them really wanted to be letters. Some of them really wanted to be, little fragments of creative nonfiction or essay. And so I just gave myself permission to just break that all up. And then once I made that decision, it all came together. It was like, yes, that was it. And so I decided not to do the abecedarian. So anyway, so I have this weird collection that's not really all poetry and it's not essays and it's not, it's a jumble of things to some people, and others it's called a hybrid. And I submit that, and I had two pieces in there that were called concrete poems, in which the shape of the prose literal on the page is an identifiable image. And in one case, it was beautiful too. It was the shape of the two hemispheres of the brain. And then I had done some blackout in there to show lesions, which is a part of the whole MS, experience. But it wouldn't have transferred well to the page. So even though it was clever and beautiful, and I think I'll make a broadside out of it someday because I thought it was really cool, I had to break it into regular stanzas to make that work, because just from a production level. So I think maybe I probably submitted to 50 places and spent a lot of money on entry fees and reading fees, like way more than people really ought to. That's just sad. And finally, Lana, who's the editor at MoonPath, said, I love this. This book needs to be out there in the world. And I felt like she was my best hope anyway, because she has a lot of compassion and she publishes a lot of people who do things that are a little askew from the norm. So I was really hopeful, and then it just worked out, and I couldn't be happier. And I feel very supported by her. She's a small press, but I kind of love the small press because they're willing to take these risks that the larger presses or even the medium ones just won't. They have a different kind of business model. I'm not sure if it's really a business model. It's more a labor of love, but I'm happy to be there. So, and it was such a great experience working with them too.
Did you want to read any selections from the book?
Sure.
Particular poems?
Yeah, I'll read. Sure, I'll read. Let's see. We've got some time. I'll read you a poem that I wrote in 2016. And that's relevant because the poem's title is Quarantine. So this was written before there was such a thing as a pandemic in this country, except for the one back, of course, in 1918. But living with multiple sclerosis or any autoimmune condition, you have to really be very careful about being around other people who are contagious with whatever. And that's because even our immune systems are compromised either by the disease itself or by the medications, which really shut down our immune systems, like literally shut them down so they don't work at all. So that puts us in a really vulnerable place where we could get, a head cold and it could lead to hospitalization for, pneumonia. I mean, it's that fast because we just don't have any of the antibodies there to fight for us. And so every flu season, I would get my vaccine for the flu, but then I would still not go anywhere. And this is true for like so many people. And so when the pandemic came around, of course, this is what everyone was doing. And some of us chronic illness people were like, yo, this is our life, it's not that big a deal. You'll be fine. It'll be fine if you can stay home. Now it's harder than that, but we already had a lot of practice. I'm kind of, pretty proud of that I was able to, it really, I was able to. So let me read this poem to you because again, there's a lot of things that were familiar, but I literally wrote this 5 years ago. Okay, it's called Quarantine. Quarantine begins between Halloween and Veterans Day after my flu inoculation. Safeway grocery shopping happens after 8 p.m. or not at all. Bottle of hand sanitizer in my pocket for times when the store supply disappears. Wearing a face mask doesn't really protect me from the hacking up of lungs and other fine particles that people seem happy to share with neighbors. I reserve these for plane trips made necessary by work interests, hoping to send a message of awareness. I have been lucky so far, head colds that last 14 days. The feels like norovirus, GI tract disruptions, more likely related to meds, but no real influenza. Immunocompromised, I belong to that exclusive club filled with babies and old people, defending against that much larger club who fears the modern miracles of vaccines, eschewing science, praising herd immunity. I'm no germaphobe. This is no hypochondriac's fable. I've been told don't risk it by more than one physician. My DMTs, that's shorthand for the medications. My DMTs render blood test results that mirror the compromise of AIDS. So I choose quarantine to survive 6 months of other people's freedom of choice. Yes, they're out there and they're deadly. People with MS die from smaller things, after all, like hospitalization for UTIs. The healthy cavalierly fend off with glasses of cranberry juice. The days dawn dark until March, prompting morning rituals with happy light and coffee cup. I can't take vacations from Facebook lest I lose touch with people who care. Ponder the simple gift of having a husband who looks forward to daily grocery trips. So isn't that strange? I mean, as I read this, I still think, wow, these are things that are now in the zeitgeist. Everybody understands this now. And I mean, I remember writing this thinking, oh, people would just think I'm making this stuff up. So it's weird. Let's see. I have others too. I'll do a couple. Okay.
Great. Yeah.
Okay. Here's one that's maybe a little more funny. I try to have a sense of humor as much as possible, and most of the time I succeed. But sometimes you just have really crappy days. But here's one where I just woke up and I just said, screw it. I'm just gonna keep going, because that's all you really can do when you have a chronic illness. Even if you feel like crap, you just do as much as you can, and don't sweat it if you can't get to it all. So this one's called Sideways. Yesterday, I woke up sideways. Descending the stairs, I used the railings without white knuckles. I don't fear new adventures anymore. My eyes cocked 45 degrees left of center, even when the crown of my head pointed straight up to the chakra constellations that orbit there, invisible. Do my eyes look funny? I asked him. He shook his head. Is my mouth drooping? He answered no. Am I walking a straight line? My eyes at slant noted the floor, found no evidence of ersatz gravity, which I assumed would be the natural outcome of life on the diagonal. You look fine to me, he said. So I sat at my desk and got to work on deadlines. That is the weird thing, having this, it's a weird symptom of feeling, you really feel, it's not even like dizziness. You just really feel like you're sideways. I don't know how else to explain it. That's the best way I know how. So, and here's another one that I think anyone can relate to, whether you have chronic illness or not. It has to do with when we go online, as we all do, looking for answers because we just don't use libraries anymore. It's just easier, right? And we go into forums, and even in the forums where people are meant to be there to help each other, like chronic illness forums, you find these predators. And so now, in the last few years, because of having a different kind of president in the White House, this has unlocked a whole new category of trolls, right? But even prior to that, these kinds of trolls existed. They were usually, not just the spammers but there were the people trying to sell you kratom. I don't know how to pronounce that, but kratom or kratom. It's that weird substance that's highly addictive, like an opioid, but you can still buy it at a cannabis shop right now. It's just crazy. They're selling that everywhere. There's, all the vitamins and all the, snake oil, basically, right? And that was already going on in the chronic illness forums. I'm actually a co-admin for one that's about 12,000 people, and we were constantly having to fight those people off. And this is like 7-8 years ago. So it's crazy. I just don't get it. I don't get it. If you have the capacity to do that, why don't you use that for good? I just don't get it. It's just not part of me. So, but anyway, this poem is really more of a flash or a prose poem. It's 4 chunks of text as opposed to stanzas with broken lines. And it's called The Expert. And this is something that every person with chronic illness has probably experienced at least once in their life when they're going online trying to, figure out something about a symptom or a diagnosis. The Expert. The expert sits online, overstimulated by blue spectrum light, scouring for evidence, though all he understands is purely anecdotal. The first person accounts, the stories from a friend of his sister's boyfriend's boss. He misinterprets clinical studies, decides 2 and 2 equal 5, wonders why science is taking so long to discover a capital C cure. He is not a biologist, but he might be a theologist. He does not know B cells from jail cells, from T cells, from killer cells, from supercells. He thinks the cure is known, locked in a cylinder in a vault in Antarctica, where nobody will ever find it except through an act of espionage. He thinks sick people are the cash cows of the corporation, that vaccines are for fools, that medicine is poison, big pharma, the enemy. But vitamins are miracles, even when they cost you your electric bill. And if you drank special water, ate special diets, performed special yoga poses, the gut biome would reverse itself and eliminate your dis-ease. Our web evangelizer believes you will fall for his friendly profile picture, the posts about his dogs, his misspelled words, and conspiracy theories posted at hours when only insomniacs breed. Who knows who he really is? To be sure, we could all stand to look in the mirror to see who we are and who we are not. So I think anybody can relate to that one. You don't have to be sick. I mean, it's just it's a crazy time we're living in. So it was so much fun to write this book. I wrote most of it around a campfire or in a camping trailer. I don't really travel well. MS kind of puts the kibosh on that. It's just exhausting to travel. And so we do a lot of camping. And I live in this beautiful part of the country where you can really leave your house and go just an hour away and just be completely far, far away.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's super nice. And so there's a place up north of where I live, an arts enclave called Port Townsend, Washington. And there's also a writers sort of community that is established there, part of the Port Townsend Writers Conference and the Centrum Arts community. And so I've spent a lot of time up there anyway, but I would often go up there with the trailer at different times of year, especially during long writing intensives that were part of the writing program, and just sit down and just read and write and cook basically and sleep. And I would say the vast majority of these poems came from that, and from in some of the cases of the writing intensives, they would have morning sessions where you would just do free writes, and then you'd have the whole rest of the day to write. And then you would meet later and then write together in silence, which seems really odd. But there is something about sitting in a room or being in the presence of creative people all creating at the same time that just is so generative. And there's an energy to that I really am sensitive to, I guess, because I always just found I wrote some of my best work has come from that experience. And there wasn't a sense of competition among writers up there. It was really just come here and just do your thing. It's safe here, and just celebrate that you have this gift, And so, yeah, I wrote most of these. I think there were only a couple of times where I actually went somewhere else because it was the winter and they didn't have something going on, and I didn't want to risk a trailer, if it was snowy out or whatever. So I would go and get an Airbnb somewhere and do that. The main thing being as long as you have Wi-Fi in case I need to do some research, but have laptop will travel, So anyway, so this book has been, and one thing I did want to say is that I'm donating all the proceeds that I earned from this book to an organization called the Accelerated Cure Project. They're really cool in that they work to take the data that the researchers collect through their, extensive research protocols, years and years, and they process it for them so that they can speed up what we understand from these studies so they can move faster and forward more quickly than if you handed it through, to the research facilities. So that's all they do. They also have a patient advocacy organization called I Conquer MS, which helps give people with MS a voice in policymaking and lobbying. So I'm giving my work to them or my proceeds to them because number one, I really think what they're doing is awesome. Number two, they have also been very supportive of creative work that's used to raise funds, as opposed to like the MS Walk and some of the more common ways that you can raise money. And of course, so that unites two interests of mine, right? And then interestingly, although I had chosen them as my nonprofit to support before the pandemic, but it turns out that of necessity, COVID-19 has really stripped all these other medical communities of their facilities and their researchers and their subjects and their supplies and everything, because we're trying to find vaccines and treatments and understand how this horrible virus works so we can contain it and wipe it out. And so all these projects that are years and years of planning and production have either been put on a wait list, or they've been canceled in the middle, or they're just not going to even happen. And so when we get to the place where we can start researching MS again, they're going to need all the help they can get. And so people like the Accelerated Cure Project are really poised to help them move forward, because even though there's a pandemic, 200 people in the US are diagnosed with MS every week. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but do the math and figure out that the cost of, I mean, literally from a pragmatic point of view, it's very costly to have MS because of all of the healthcare usage that it demands. There's lots of MRIs, which are hugely expensive, and medications. The medication I was taking is, I didn't pay for this, but it's like $92,000 a year. It's crazy. I don't have to pay that, and I'm actually not taking medication. I'm on a medication break right now, which is kind of interesting during a pandemic. So yeah, that's why I didn't choose them for that, but it's really fortuitous that I'm able to. I'm sure I'm not going to make huge amounts of money to be able to fund an entire research study, but I could at least fund these people doing this, work in the basement on their computer in the dead of night, because that's kind of what they are. They're these nerds that are just crushing data and making sure that it gets out there so that we can keep moving forward. So I'm happy to help pay their salary at least.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. And how has the public reaction been so far? Have you introduced your collection to like the MS community, and how do they?
Yeah, I have. I've had a few. It's the pandemic again. I hate having to go back to it, but it shapes everything, right? And so right now everything has to be virtual. There are no bookstore readings and book tours and stuff. Not that I would have had one, because a debut poet is not going to have a fancy book tour. I might get in my car and drive around the state and go to all the local bookstores, and that might be it. So, and that would probably be all on my dime. So, but so the virtual thing is like pros and cons. So the pros are that I had two launch parties in February. One was for the East Coast and Midwest folks, and one was for the Mountain Time and Pacific Coast folks, because I have people all over the country that wanted to come, and it was just really hard to find the right time. So that's an issue with virtual, as you have to figure out the right time. You're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. And so the first one was on the East Coast, and it was I was able to include the Accelerated Cure Project director, Sarah Loud, in that. So she was able to actually talk about her own thing. But there were a lot of my peers there, and it was so great because I write about MS with all these other people, and occasionally we all do get together. Some of us all work for the same company, and they're amazing in that they annually, typically not during a pandemic, have a conference every year where they pay all their writers to come together in one spot in Philadelphia, and have like a mini conference. And so you get to actually see your people. And so, we haven't been able to see each other, and maybe we'll be able to this next fall. Who knows? We just don't know. But I was able to then go and have this launch reading, and I see all these friendly faces. And so that's a plus, because there's no way I would have been able to have a book launch that included them, because they're on the East Coast, right? And that's even true on the West Coast, because I have friends down in California and up in Vancouver and so forth. So, but the hard part is that you have to then learn how to use online software and how to do a reading in a Zoom type forum. And there's all these other technical things. You have to really work with MailChimp and all this stuff that I'm not used to. And those are the kinds of things that like tax me. For me, my MS is more of an executive function labor more than one where, I can walk fine. Usually it's more stuff that's literally all in my head. So it's visual, it's speech. You heard me do a little stumbling in my speech because that's part of it. But also just executive function things. And so learning, I've always prided myself on being an early adopter, always. But now it's just so hard. It's so hard. And then to be organized on top of that. And so that's been the hard part. But yes, I've received lots of interest from people in the MS community. I was interviewed for the FUMS podcast by Kathy Young. It's a really great MS podcast. It is called FUMS for what you think it's called. That's all what it's about. It's a great podcast. And so I feel like in the world of MS, I feel like my peers there, I've also gotten some really nice reviews. So I'm really excited about that. Of course, these aren't, New York Times level reviews or anything like that, but
Mhm.
it doesn't matter because I want to just get these books in the hands of people who need them. And that may not be just the average Joe, although I would love for them to read my books too. I think most of my readers are either people who who in just general like hybrid experimental writing forms, or medical, what do you call it, medical memoir, because there's sort of a medical memoir kind of quality to this book, or people who have chronic illness who just want to hear the voices and ideas from other people and learn their stories, and um, learn some cues for how to move forward, because none of us get, even with the best doctors, I have great doctors, we still don't know what to do as we move forward. We're all just guessing. We're all kind of guinea pigs in a sense, because they don't really know what causes this disease. And until they know what causes it, they can only help you deal with the symptoms and maybe stop it from getting worse.
Mhm.
And so, but there's lots of research happening right now that,
Mhm.
and keeping the fingers crossed. So
Mhm. Are you currently working on any upcoming projects? Like are you working like another collection of poetry or a collection of stories?
yeah, actually, I have a short story collection that's been in the works for a while, and I'm actually just going to self-publish it because
Mhm.
I just want to. I want to try that and see what that's like. Having to promote my own poetry book has taught me a lot about how to promote books in general without, a
Mhm.
big budget. So why not? All of the stories, except for two in this collection, have already been published, so I know they're obviously good enough if they've already been accepted and put out into the world by other people. Um, and because I write this sort of odd, slipstream, magical realism, urban
Mhm.
fantasy kind of genre, there's some magical things happening, and speculative, I guess, is probably the
Mhm.
best umbrella I could all put it all underneath. It all kind of hangs together. And I do have a friend who's an editor who's helping me put it together. And so after I finish this virtual book tour that I'm doing right now, which takes up a lot of extra time, I'm going to sit down and we're going to get that ball rolling, because I'm ready to do that. And then I do have some starts for a collection of poetry. I spend a lot of time outside, Northwest, you kind of do,
Mhm.
So there's definitely a lot of poems in my just, batch that I've written over the years that sort of speak to life in this part of the country. But I'm also an avid gardener, and I'd like to have a collection of work about that experience. And then, as we talked about earlier, I'd really love to write more about the dreamscape.
Mhm.
I'm totally fascinated with it. I mean, I have these dreams in which I go to places more than once, and different stories take place in those same places, which are not real places, but they
Mhm.
keep coming back as real
Mhm.
places. So to me, it's like a parallel universe kind of
Mhm.
thing going on in
Mhm.
there. And some people might be afraid or think that's weird, but I'm just like, I can't wait to go to bed at night because I don't know where I'm going to head. And it's going to be cool to see what happens. And by and large, I don't have a lot of anxiety dreams. So mostly it's just like, just being inside these weird spaces and just watching things unfold. And in fact, some of the stories in my short story collection came from my dreams. They were
Mhm.
literally, I got to write this down because this is just like a beginning to end story arc. How did that happen? But that's what happens in my dreams. And that's probably just because I've been honing storytelling skills my whole life. And so that just comes out in my dreams too. But I'll take it, whatever it
Mhm.
works. So, yeah, so those are kind of some of the projects. Right now, I'm like super busy though with, it's funny. The pandemic has really created these strange, like, categories in terms of work. For me, work got busier because when you're talking about illness of any kind during pandemic, there's lots of added concerns. And
Mhm.
so I feel like I've had to do more writing for work related projects, which I love. but then my creative writing has kind of slid by the wayside. And I think it's kind of like I'm in the middle of the storm and it's really hard for me to write about it right now. Some people can, but I feel like I need some space away from it. And maybe it's just that I just need to go somewhere and write about it, because that's what I usually do. But almost all of our camping trips were canceled last year. We have 6 this year that we're holding firm that they're gonna still be a go. One of our trips last fall was canceled. We were ready to go. It was literally like the day before, and they said no. It was on an Indian reservation, and they actually had to shut the resort down to make it a site for healthcare workers to stay and to quarantine. And I was like, oh my gosh. So we're going to be going there. We just rescheduled, but it's like, wow, that's such a weird thing you wouldn't think about in a pandemic, that even that would happen, Geez. So yeah, so it's been kind of a weird year. I haven't been super productive as a creative writer, but it's all in the course of trying to get a book out into the world. So I spent last summer editing and picking out the cover, and then, doing the galleys, and then, it got released in January, and then it's all about promotions, just to try to get it out, get the word out. And then working, and then I have this writing, coaching hybrid thing that I was talking about that I'm still trying to formulate to help people who want to write about their illness. So it's hard. It's been kind of creative in some ways, really super creative, because there's not a lot of exterior, demands on my time, because no one's going anywhere. But on the other hand, I'm kind of exhausted, and someone said, when you're in survival mode, it's really hard to be creative, except in ways that help you to survive, And so I'm like, okay, I'm good with that. I mean, and I don't feel like, if I haven't written anything, that I have lost a moment. I don't really write about my children either. And I haven't for, even though that they're now grown, I can kind of think about it. But, I had friends who were mothers of young children, and they'd write about that. I'm like, I just can't. I'm not right in the middle of it. So I'm not sure I can really see and be reflective. It's so present. I can't break away and look at it at to me, what might be a more appropriate distance, So anyway, yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting time. I mean, I know some people who lost their jobs, of course, and a lot of, including some writers, and then teachers now are starting to lose their jobs because of the pandemic. And a lot of those people are English and literature teachers at the college level who are friends of mine, and now they're like, have been cut adrift, and great teachers. And it's like, wow, how does this happen? So what a strange year, right?
Yeah.
And it's not really going in going anywhere anytime soon. So, but we just got to keep doing what we do. And I think the lesson in living with a new diagnosis is the same. It's the same answer that you would, how do you deal with it? You just get up and you just keep going. There really isn't any other option. I mean, some people will say to me, Tamara, how do you do it all? How do you get up? And it's like, well, what else am I going to do? I mean, you just have to. And sometimes I feel like I'm so exhausted. I have such fatigue. I've had those moments where I just really I might get out of bed, but I might just move to the couch and, I sleep. And I've just learned to forgive myself for that, because I know that when I have the energy, I'll make up for it. And it's better than nothing.
What do you find to be the biggest joys and challenges, either in regards to your writing or with your sleep work?
The biggest challenges, the fatigue, they call it cog fog. And now that seems to be like a really common phrase now. It wasn't a few years ago so much, but in the mainstream now, and partly because of the pandemic. I mean, your sense of time is lost when you work from home. I've been working from home forever, but I know that it's really challenging for other people. So cognitive fog, this like having this, ambition, and then just being exhausted, and literally like by the middle of the day, like usually this time of day, you're just like, oh, you're putting your head in your hands, and you're like, barely, looking at your screen with one eye open because you're just so tired, and yet you still have to get your work done. I'm fortunate that I work with a company. One of my clients they have a no commitment. So they're like, you write when you're ready to, and we'll take it, because they know that they're working, all of their people that write for them are people living with chronic illness. So they're like, don't worry about the deadline, which is so weird because I'm a journalist. I mean, I studied journalism, and deadline is everything. So the deadline pressures all come, that's all something I impose on myself. So I sit there and I get really tired, and then, but I finally learned to, forgive myself if I've had a bad day. And actually, what I've actually really learned is that once you start feeling some symptoms, you just shut things down. It's time. It's time. You can get back to it. Don't wait for it to like really turn you into a slug where you can't even move. It's better to just take those signals, listen to your body, and say, you know what, I can't do this right now. And that's okay, because I'll be able to do it another time, hopefully. So the challenges are usually cognitive. Word finding and speech issues can be a challenge. Actually, the chief complaint that sent me to the doctor that led to my MS diagnosis was I was in school for sleep technology, and I cracked open a textbook. It was finals week, and I was, this big fat sleep medicine textbook, and I was opening it up to go and pour over my notes. And I couldn't read. And I mean, I could see, I took this book with me and drove to a coffee house to sit down, have a giant latte, and do my studies. And I couldn't read. It was like staring at, some secret code or the Cyrillic alphabet or something that I just couldn't possibly decipher. And I was like, this is not right. And so I called my doctor. I was in by that afternoon. One of the benefits sometimes of living a little bit away from the city is you might be able to get to the doctor faster. And I had a great doctor. He's retired now. I'm really sad. But he asked me a bunch of interesting questions, and after I described what was going on. And then they had a portable MRI unit in the parking lot right outside. And he's like, there's an opening. Why don't you walk over there and get an MRI? So I did. And within 2 days, he had given me a preliminary diagnosis of MS. And it was because of this inability to read. Now, I had all these other symptoms for a long time, possibly for most of my life, but they never all came together. So the very first symptom, we think now, sitting with my neurologist, we talked about different kinds of symptoms that I've had. When I can actually read a piece that would describe that.
Sure.
You want me to do that?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
let me do that. Because this happened when I was 9, and now I know what it is. But we didn't, nobody knew much about MS in 1975, so the only word that I would say is unusual in here is the word pleurisy, and that sort of is a reference to a lung condition that's kind of an old school, like pneumonia or a lung infection kind of, pleurisy is just sort of a umbrella term for any kind of like infection in your lung, So let me just read this to you. August 1975. It first happened when she was a month shy of 10, a curly brown ribbon of a girl who played softball, fished for crappie, read books in her cool walkout basement on hot summer days, rode her bike in endless circles. A girl without a stitch of fat, a lean, muscular thing, flush with the energy that radiated from the ever curious coals of her brain. A perpetual motion kind of girl, but an obedient girl who rarely asked for attention, who rarely complained of anything except for going to bed at a decent hour. That day, she would pick blackberries in the orchards across the street with one of many best friends named Michelle she would have throughout her life. She laced her shoes, tugged her hand-me-down Wrangler cutoffs into place, grabbed the Tupperware bowl, and stood there. Large grips, stiff and unrelenting, pinched her around the ribcage. She likened them to the curved claws of a 1960s TV show robot. Her fingers fumbled the bowl. It banged in its hollow plastic voice across the wood parquet floor. Instinctively, she stood even straighter than before, tried to breathe, those intercostal efforts abandoned as the cinching grew severe. Her breaths came shallow, followed by stars in her eyes. Her grandmother sidled in from the kitchen. Raise your arms. The girl tried to, but the pain seized fresh her ribcage, spasming. Her brown eyes pooled with involuntary tears. She dropped to the floor, a cat on all fours, writhing in the grips of an invisible vice. As quickly as it had stormed her body, the seizure released. She heaved, young lungs refreshing, tears dropping like rain to dot the squares of yellowed wood around her star-shaped hands. Her mother walked in then, concern in her eyes. Just a touch of pleurisy, her grandmother said. So that describes something known as it's called girdle band sensation among healthcare folks, but it's colloquially called the MS hug, which is just cruel because there's nothing comforting about this hug, but it's just this, it's the muscles of your rib cage and even your diaphragm, which you use to breathe, they all become like a giant Charlie horse, like on steroids, really just super strong. And I still get those. That's probably the most painful aspect of MS that I have to deal with. And I have a medication that I take just when that happens, and you never know when they're going to come. And they can last 5 minutes, they can last a couple of days. And so you can only really shallow breathe up toward the top of your, near your breastbone or your clavicle or whatever, you really, collarbone, that's where you can breathe. You can't breathe through your chest at all because it's like rock hard. And it's funny, I have a massage therapist who helps a lot with treatment, just trying to knead out all the stiffness in my muscles because it's just an ongoing thing. And she describes it as like massaging a curb because my muscles in my legs are just like rocks, and not because I'm buff at all, but because they're just always bound up in this spasm. And some of it I'm just kind of used to, but man, she gets in there and she manages to release some of that tension. It's amazing. But the MS hug is probably the worst of it. So I've had these symptoms, different ones, my whole life. I had this one. I've had the fatigue, all across. But I always just thought, I'm a working mom. Everyone's tired, I mean, it's easy to just assume that. Back right after September 11th, we were all a little stressed back then, right? And stress is a big trigger. And I had a lot of these weird neurological sensations called paresthesia, which is like these sweeping, tingling sensations that kind of cross the bands of your nerves. They're called dermatomes in your body. And that would just happen. And it didn't hurt or anything, but it was weird. But I never thought to mention it. But that's a huge sign of a neurological problem. Had no idea. The fatigue, of course. And then, of course, when I suddenly couldn't read. And then not long after that, I started having problems with my speech where I would begin a sentence like I'm talking to my husband, and then I wouldn't finish it. Although in my head, I had finished it. So it's like I stopped speaking it. My husband would look at me and go, and waiting for me to finish. I'm like, didn't you just hear what I said? And he's like, no. And then I realized that there was this like weird miscommunication with my speech center and my brain. And I realized that when you start getting tired, you just have to just like hunker down. It's kind of like a person with a migraine. You hunker down until it passes because it's going to be there and you're not going to be able to quote unquote power through it, So if there's a hidden blessing in all of that, it's that when you live with a chronic illness, you maybe in some ways learn to take care of yourself in the way you always should have, but you just never thought you could just power through it. But no, you really can't get away with that. It's not really possible in case it might even make it worse for you to power through it, and then just know what triggers things and what you can and can't tolerate. Like, I can't really do crowds that much anymore. I mean, I went to it was like 2 years after my diagnosis, and we went to the Chinese New Year's event down in downtown Seattle in the International District. Food trucks everywhere, a parade. Oh my gosh, there's so much noise. And I didn't realize, I wasn't really paying attention, but I'm really sensitive to noise, especially if I'm in the midst of an attack, as they call them. And so you jump at everything. And what do you hear during a parade but fireworks? Chinese New Year's parade. And so we were down there, and I was like, after making that whole effort just to even get there, because we lived on an island, we need to take a ferry, and we walked up the hill. And I was like, I can't stay. It's just like way too much. And then I was unable to really even have a conversation with my husband because I was just in this huge sensory overload. So learning from those things and just checking off, I kept a symptom journal and checked things off, and just said, okay, well, I know that if this is happening, then I just can't do that. So I just, or if I have to do something where I know I'm going to be tired, like traveling, or if I have to go to the airport for, there's lots of crowds there, I just know that I'm going to have to spend some time recovering from it after I get where I'm going. And that seems to be, just have to add an extra day on either end of a trip, say, and then just be willing to just drop plans. My friends, I mean, they they don't call me this. I call myself this, but I call myself miss 30% because I missed about 30% of everything I planned. But, I mean, my friends are like, that's fine. The friends that are there for you they totally get it. There are friends that kind of fall away because they don't, and whatever, because there are other friends that come up and you just didn't even realize how awesome they were. So it all evens out.
So I really loved your collection of poetry. I found it very educational because there's so much about MS I wasn't familiar with before I read it.
Oh, great!
Yeah, I hope it inspires others. Who.
I do too. What did you have a favorite in there?
I mean, I liked it all collectively.
Okay, good.
And I felt like I sort of like needed you add like different quotes and stuff in some of the poems, and you like had different references in that. So I love all that.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. I really feel like it really, I mean, you can take different pieces out of it and read them and they have their own value, but the goal really was to have this, it read as a body of work as opposed to, things, strung together like beads on a string. I wanted it to actually be a full necklace, if you will. So I'm glad that you found that. And I really hope that I do really feel, and we talked about art therapy earlier, I do really feel that it's therapeutic for me, but it's also, I think the arts are like an underappreciated way to help people get through, could be chronic illness, it could be trauma, it could be disability, it could be being the victim of a criminal, it could be anything where we're really vulnerable and feeling pain and fear. The arts are like the place that we really, I wish our culture would would invest more in the arts as a way to heal us as human beings. It makes so much sense. I can think of like so many books and so many movies and paintings. My daughter's a dancer, and I've gone to some of her shows and have just walked away feeling like maybe not personally healed, but seeing their healing on the stage and how that could heal other people. It's just phenomenal. But we tend to look more toward, and I love science, obviously. I have 2 medical degrees, credentials. So yeah, I love science, and go science. We need that. But it's not the only place to find truth. Poetry, we can find truth, and performing arts and visual arts and music's like one of the most healing forms of art that ever existed. I mean, if you're feeling really low, just turn on some music, it will change everything. So I think that I wish there were more ways to explain and educate about things that are complicated like MS, because it's really a complex disease, in a way that brings people to an understanding without them feeling, I don't know. I feel like when I read my book, or when others read my book and respond to it, where I read to them, that the response is not, oh, I feel sorry for her, her life sucks, but oh, this is interesting. And there's some things I didn't know about the human brain. And wow, there's some tools for getting through this. And it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, I think a lot of people, especially with MS, the image of a person with MS is always one of a person in a wheelchair. And a couple of things to that. First of all, I have two really good friends with MS. And so when I was diagnosed, both of them were very active and they're working mothers. One, she just now retired, but she was a life flight nurse, which is like one of the most stressful jobs, physical jobs, right? And then she ended up being like a critical care nurse. And the other one runs a bookstore in a city. I mean, that's not exactly, easy work. So these are women that are out living full lives, living their best lives. And so when I was diagnosed, I didn't take it as, oh, you're going to be in a wheelchair in 5 years. I was like, okay, I'm going to deal with whatever I've been given, but I'm going to make it work somehow. But the fact is that most people in general, including myself, before I understood MS, just thought when my friends were diagnosed, I just thought, oh, that's like the worst. It's like a death sentence. Well, no, of course it's not. I mean, you could technically die from complications of MS. That's absolutely true. But that's not the reality. The reality is that you have to you keep on living and you deal with your symptoms however you can. I feel blessed that I don't have the severe case that many of my peers do. And then I have some friends who are in wheelchairs who don't have any of the executive function problems I have. They're sharp as tacks. And so it's kind of fun to go back and forth with them because they also have the same attitude as you, just keep going. I mean, and so anyway, it's quite a journey. And so having this book is kind of, I do have references to roadmaps in this. And one of the later poems is about, getting relearning the geography of the body and the brain, maybe in a way to find your way from here to there. Which is kind of what life's all about anyway, whether you have MS or not. So I did want to hopefully convey that it's just one person's journey and that it doesn't have to be a death sentence. And it's just something we have to work with. Everyone's kind of broken or sick or has some kind of, obstacle in their life. It's true for everybody. So having good health is actually quite temporary. We all are going to have failing health at some point. So I got mine a little bit earlier. Most of my peers with MS, they start out in their 20s, and that's a very different experience because their lives are stretched out ahead of them. And so they have different challenges because they're raising children and dealing with all that. And I didn't, I was having some of the symptoms, but never really had that awareness. And so, it's really a strange place to be when you develop an awareness of something in your body. It has a name. And then I want to pursue this actually in some writing, the idea of the diagnosis mind, because once you become diagnosed, you become aware of yourself for the first time in a completely wholly new way. And it kind of colors everything, which could be good, but it can also be really not good, not healthy. At some point, I think it's more part of that stages of grief that you go through when you get a diagnosis like that. And then if you're able to do things like write poetry or make art that expresses how you're feeling at these different stages of acceptance of this new reality in your life, then some of that diagnosis mind just falls away. And then you get to go back to being the person you always were, because you're still the same person you were even the day after you were diagnosed, or the day before. So I'm just really glad that I was able to write about it. And now that I have this book and it's all in one collection, I'm really proud of it. If it's the only book I ever publish, I'll be glad and say that I have this book that I'm really proud of.
That's great. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Thanks for tuning in to the special National Poetry Month podcast episode of the Erratic Dispatches, featuring the guest Tamara Sellman discussing her poetry collection called Intention Tremor. For the profile page for this podcast episode, I've included links in which you could purchase Intention Tremor from Tamara's official website, and proceeds for the book are going towards the MS organization called the Accelerated Cure Project. I've also included a link to the Accelerated Cure Project's official website and also links to Tamara's social media accounts for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for tuning into this latest episode. I'll be back soon with a new episode. Take care. Bye-bye.